It finally happened. After more than 3 years of war between Russia and Ukraine, the European Union, or EU, has pulled out the big guns. The EU just stunned Russia by unveiling a massive gas ban plan that threatens to devastate Russia's economy. President Vladimir Putin's reliance on his gas profits has just gone up in smoke. And with it comes another shot to his ability to fund his seemingly never-ending campaign against Ukraine. The move was a long time coming, but it also isn't as simple as the EU instituting an immediate ban. What comes next, along with the aftermath of the ban itself, could change the shape of the entire Ukraine war. On May 6, the Kyiv Independent shared the basics of the EU's new gas ban. It says that after spending the last 3 years slowly weaning itself away from Russia's gas, the EU has finally decided that it's time to turn off the taps completely. Only, it won't be doing it straight away. The new EU ruling sets a phased approach, aiming to ban new Russian gas contracts by the end of 2025 and to cease all imports by the end of 2027. The EU's Energy Commissioner, Dan Jurgensen, was bullish when making the announcement. "No more shall euros go into Russia's war chest," he proclaimed. "Your gas will be banned, your shadow fleet will be stopped." The EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, was similarly combative in her stance, adding, "Energy that comes to our continent should not pay for a war of aggression against Ukraine." She said that the EU owed this to our citizens, to our companies, and to our brave Ukrainian friends. These announcements were accompanied by a detailed roadmap explaining how the next 2 years are supposed to go for the EU. It all starts with banning contracts. By the end of 2025, no EU member will be able to form a new contract with Russia for the supply of gas. Member states also can't form short-term contracts after 2025, meaning there's no room for a country to create a contract to use Russian gas for a few months in 2026 before the final 2027 cutoff. With those new and short-term contracts handled, the EU will then turn its attention to existing long-term contracts its members hold with Russia. These make up the bulk of the EU's reliance on Russia's gas, accounting for around 2/3 of all of the gas Putin sells. By the end of 2027, all of those contracts will be cancelled, leaving Putin with 0 EU customers. It's important to point out that no EU customers doesn't mean no European customers for Russia. Not every European country is part of the bloc. Russia will still have the ability to sell to those countries, though it's possible the EU may pressure non-members and even dangle the carrots of membership in front of them to convince them to go along with its plans. And that's not all. Euronews says that the EU plans to follow up on all of these contract cancellations by implementing further restrictions designed to crack down on the shadow fleet Jurgensen mentions in his comments. That fleet came to the forefront following the implementation of heavy sanctions against Russia in the wake of Putin's Ukraine invasion. The European Parliament says that this fleet is a collection of older vessels that have complicated ownership structures and make use of tactics designed to conceal their true origins. Russia has been using these ships to continue exporting its fossil fuels to customers, skirting sanctions in the process. The EU plans to stop these workarounds by blacklisting shadow fleet vessels, denying them access to EU ports and services, and implementing insurance verification requirements. Still, the shadow fleet isn't the headline here. The most important takeaway is that Putin has 2 more years to sell as much gas as he can to EU members before they permanently pull the plug, and he'll have his work cut out for him. With no new contracts being signed, combined with the termination of existing contracts, the EU's move can only mean one thing for Russia. It's about to take a massive economic hit. And it's a hit that's been a long time coming. Even the roadmap that the EU just presented was supposed to arrive earlier than it has. The new European Commission intended to present it during the first 100 days of its formation, only for those plans to fall by the wayside amidst bureaucratic delays and uncertainty relating to US President Donald Trump's push for peace in Ukraine. There are also issues with some of the EU's more pro-Russia members to consider. Both Hungary and Slovakia have expressed varying levels of support for Putin in the past, and they won't be eager to cut off their dependence on Russia's oil. The EU seems to be taking a hard stance with both of them. It's requiring Hungary and Slovakia to submit individual plans for how they'll phase out Russian gas over the next 2 years, which are to include details on how they'll end their long-term contracts with Putin. The contract issue is interesting. How can the EU justify breaking legal documents its members have signed with Russia? Force majeure is one of the options that the EU is considering to terminate contracts with Russian providers. According to the Kyiv Independent, the EU intends to argue that Putin's Ukraine invasion created force majeure conditions that justify any decision its members make to end their contracts early. Force majeure is a legal construct typically inserted into contracts that allows any party to break the contract due to unexpected events taking place that are outside at least one of the parties' control. Such clauses are typically used to account for issues such as natural disasters that prevent a party from fulfilling its obligations. But in the EU's case, it intends to use force majeure to argue that Putin's invasion represents an unforeseen event that gives its members the right to walk away. If the EU's roadmap is anything to go by, those members are preparing to walk away en masse. The EU's latest move shouldn't come as too much of a shock given the weight of sanctions it's already placed on Russia. Since February 2022, according to Castellum.ai, a total of 21,692 sanctions have been levied against Russia, 2,234 of which come from the EU. Several EU nations have also created sanctions independent of the bloc, with France being a key example. It's levied 2,175 of its own sanctions against Russia, in addition to the similar number in which it participates as part of its EU membership. However, the simple fact that the EU has levied so many sanctions against Russia leads to an obvious question. What took it so long when it came to gas? That's not to ask what took so long in terms of the European Commission missing its 100-day deadline for the roadmap here. Rather, Russia invaded Ukraine over 3 years ago. The EU banning gas imports in 2022 rather than 2025 would have taken a massive bite out of Putin's ability to find that invasion back when it first started. So why has the EU waited until now to finally ban Russian gas imports? The simple answer is that it had to. The EU was, and still is, far more reliant on Russian gas than it would like to be. That reliance has been falling in recent years. The Council of the European Union makes that much clear, noting that Russia accounted for around 40% of the pipeline gas imported to the EU in 2021. By 2024, that number had dropped to 11%, indicating that the EU has spent the last 3 years seeking alternatives to a country that at one point provided nearly half of the gas the bloc used. But it's not as simple as turning off the pipeline tap and buying from other countries for the EU. New suppliers had to be found. Contracts had to be signed. Even now, the EU hasn't managed to completely wean itself of the Russian gas treaty. By the end of 2024, Russia was still supplying 31.62 billion cubic meters, or BCM, of pipeline gas and 20.05 BCM of liquid natural gas, or LNG. The tide, though, has been slowly shifting. Norway has emerged as the largest and most important supplier of gas to the EU since Putin invaded Ukraine. In 2024, its share of the EU's natural gas imports in gaseous state was 45.6%. Other nations, including the US, Algeria, Qatar and the UK, have also benefited from the EU's move away from Russia's gas, with each claiming larger shares of the EU gas market as a result. The US has also steamrolled Russia to become the EU's largest supplier of LNG, accounting for around 45% of the 100 BCM of LNG the EU imported in 2024. All of these are positive moves when it comes to the EU disentangling itself from Russia on the gas front. However, they don't change the fact that Russia remains a major supplier. Even by the end of 2024, the combination of EU purchases of pipeline gas and LNG meant that Russia was responsible for supplying around 19% of the EU's total gas consumption. And those sales led to a profit for Putin. In 2024 alone, over $26 billion flowed into Putin's coffers from Europe, money which he used to continue funding his Ukraine invasion. Therein lies the biggest bone of contention many, especially those in Ukraine, have had with the EU taking so long to cut Russia's gas supplies off. Despite all of its talk and many of its actions designed to showcase support for Ukraine, the EU was still sending Russia billions of dollars. Commentators the world over pointed out the hypocrisy of this approach, with Chatham House being among the most vocal. In June 2024, it published an article outlining how the EU's self-interest on the gas front meant that it was jeopardizing its own foreign policy goals. On one hand, the EU wanted to use a combination of financial pressure and its military aid donations to push Putin out of Ukraine. On the other, it was supplying Russia's leader with a revenue stream that made it easier for him to continue his campaign of aggression. With its foreign policy and energy security goals at odds with each other, the EU is stuck in a catch-22, Chatham House said last June. While plans have been made to phase out Russian fossil fuels by 2027, the continued reliance on indirect Russian pipeline gas or LNG is problematic. The mention of energy security leads to the main reason it's taken so long for the EU to create its ban. Volatility has reigned since Putin's invasion when it comes to gas prices. The EU's official website notes that volatility is still a problem. In 2024 alone, household gas prices increased for 6 of the bloc's members, though they decreased for 14 nations. There was better news on the non-household gas front, with prices decreasing for 21 EU members and only rising for 2. Sweden, Italy and the Netherlands were the hardest hit on the household front, with Swedish gas consumers paying 6 times the price Hungarian households paid for gas, and 54% more than the EU average price. Remember that Hungary is one of the few nations allied to Russia. What can be seen in Sweden is a microcosm of the control Putin has exerted over Europe with his fossil fuels. He's essentially been able to raise prices in Sweden, a country to which he's opposed due to its decision to join NATO, while keeping prices in Hungary low in return for that nation semi-allying with him. The EU had hoped to absorb this sort of volatility by maintaining its gas relationships with Russia for several years. Now Putin's invasion is in its 4th year, it's becoming more obvious just how much havoc he can wreak on EU members economically. Russia is no longer the safe supply of gas. The EU in response is finally committing to pulling away. It's a move that should have happened a long time ago, but that's beside the point now. It's happening and Putin will be furious. The slow road to change is in place, and the EU is going to spend the next 2 years navigating it. To make things even worse for Putin, the loss of gas sales to the EU will ultimately mean that all of his fossil fuel revenue from the bloc is going up in smoke. The EU's gas ban follows on from bans the bloc has implemented against Russian crude oil and coal. The crude ban was especially damaging to Russia. The EU no longer accepts seaborne crude or refined petroleum from Russia, though it still buys limited amounts of pipeline oil. It's also party to price fixing of Russian crude oil that prevents Putin from selling one of his country's most important products for more than $60 per barrel. The EU also announced a ban on all Russian coal imports shortly after Putin invaded Ukraine. As seen with gas, the EU has found alternative suppliers for oil and coal, which all adds up to a major problem for Putin. His country is being increasingly isolated and prevented from selling its most important products. That leads to what the EU's gas ban means for the Russian economy. It's not good news for Putin. As mentioned earlier, the EU is still spending billions of dollars annually on Russian gas. To emphasize that problem, the amount the bloc spent on Russia's oil and gas in 2024 exceeded the military aid provided to Ukraine in the same period. Putin received about $24 billion from combined oil and gas sales in that year. Ukraine, on the other hand, only got around $20.4 billion in aid from the EU. There's a disparity there created by the EU's reliance on Russia's fossil fuels. And it's a disparity that Putin has been able to leverage to keep his military funded, and some might argue, essentially cancel out the impact of the EU's donations to Ukraine. Vaibhav Raghunandan, who co-authored the report that revealed these shocking figures, was clear on how this looked for the EU in terms of Ukraine war optics. Purchasing Russian fossil fuels is, quite plainly, akin to sending financial aid to the Kremlin and enabling its invasion. Raghunandan said in The Guardian, "It's a practice that must stop immediately to secure not just Ukraine's future, but also Europe's energy security. The stop may not be immediate, but it's coming by 2027. Feeding into the energy security issue, Beyond Fossil Fuels also notes that the EU could have spent the money it's given to Russia on alternatives that lead to a greener continent. It claims the EU could have made 2.559 million solar-powered homes, built 6,550 onshore wind turbines, developed 1,063 offshore turbines, or installed over 3.5 million heat pumps rather than send the billion it has to Russia. All of this is mentioned to demonstrate the sheer scale of the financial loss Russia is going to have to absorb if the EU follows through on its plan to end all of its gas contracts with the country by 2027. The tens of billions of dollars Putin was receiving from the EU annually, and as recently as 2024, are set to disappear, which couldn't have come at a worse time for Russia's leader. Why? The Ukraine war is wreaking havoc with Russia's economy. Back in December 2024, former US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin revealed that Russia had likely spent at least $200 billion on Putin's Ukraine invasion since February 2022. Austin also said that Russia's defense budget had soared to levels not seen since the Cold War era, with 2024 alone seeing Putin allocate $112 billion for defense. In 2025, Russia is expected to raise its military budget again. It'll spend $142 billion, said Austin, which accounts for 32.5% of the country's government spending. That level of spending is only possible because Russia managed to maintain its somewhat shaky position as one of the world's leading suppliers of fossil fuels. The EU's ban on gas imports won't shake Russia from that particular perch. It can still sell to China and several of its other allies. However, Putin is going to have a hard time replacing over $20 billion of annual income come 2027, especially during a period when he's draining Russia's financial reserves to fund his supposed special military operation. Beyond the loss of gas income, Putin also has to deal with the fact that the EU's roadmap also covers nuclear exports. The Kyiv Independent points out that member states that are still reliant on energy sourced from Russia's nuclear reactors are going to be encouraged to look for alternative sources. That's another massive slice of the Russian economic pie. EU nations had increased their reliance on Russian nuclear energy in the wake of Putin's invasion. They collectively spent around $318 million on this fuel in 2022, rising to almost $780 million a year later. These numbers are nowhere near what was being spent on Russia's fossil fuels, but the loss of hundreds of millions more dollars to go along with the disappearance of billions caused by the gas ban will still hurt Putin. It's all pretty simple to sum up. In 2027, Russia loses access to a massive cash flow. The loss of that money means Putin will struggle to fund his war machine, which could also open up more opportunities for Ukraine to reclaim its territory, assuming the war is still ongoing by that deadline. Ukraine also benefits from the fact that the EU is no longer going to be sending what amounts to military aid to Russia, increasing the impact of the weapons it receives from the bloc. However, it's also hard to ignore the potential impact that this decision may have on EU member nations. The bloc still gets a huge portion of its gas from Russia, even with its recent efforts to reduce reliance. Now that it's talking about breaking contracts, more volatility might lie in store for the EU's energy prices at a time when many of the bloc's members are still dealing with price rises that resulted from Putin's initial invasion. As the Kyiv Independent puts it, the EU's plan still hinges on a delicate balance. The bloc is hoping to achieve a gradual phase-out that won't trigger sudden price shocks or energy shortages. Part of its approach involves building the EU's own LNG capacity to the point where it reaches 200 BCM, which covers the shortfall caused by the loss of Russia. Still, a lot has to go the EU's way for this plan to work with no major economic impact on its members. What happens if Putin decides to retaliate by pulling out of contracts earlier than the EU expects? It could happen, though this would be an instance of Putin hurting himself because it's clear how much he needs to extract every dollar possible from the gas deals Russia already has in place. The EU may also have to deal with some of its member states, notably Hungary, dragging their feet on pulling out of gas deals. If that happens, Russia might be able to maintain some of its profits, allowing it to impact gas prices elsewhere to the point where the EU can't afford the price shocks it wants to prevent. For now, the outcome remains uncertain. The first real indications of the impact the EU's decision will have, both on Russia and itself, will come at the end of 2025 when short-term contracts are cancelled and no new contracts are being signed. By 2027, the EU needs to be ready with alternatives to make its plan feasible. It's on the way to getting there, but whether it will be ready by its own deadline may ultimately determine the success of its massive gas ban. But what do you think about the EU's Russian gas ban? Is it a case of too little, too late, or being hindered by the 2-year roadmap? How will the ban impact Putin's ability to wage war against Ukraine? Will the Ukraine war still be raging in 2027 when the ban comes into full effect? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-the-minute news and information on the latest developments in the Ukraine war, the Middle East, and other conflicts around the globe.